Well, it's about time we had another interview, Tom. So tell us about time. That seems to be a very confusing subject.
Well, first let me tell you my theory of why everyone's so confused about it. I got a question, I think on Fireside Chat a couple of months ago, where the asker said he named 4 or 5 very wise yogis and high muftis of spiritual knowledge around the world, mostly I guess in the East, but other places. And he said, Tom, all of these people, all of these highly spiritual, highly knowledgeable gurus agree that there is no time, that time is an illusion, and that it doesn't really exist, and that what we call the future and the present and the past all coexist simultaneously, that there is no time. And you seem to disagree with that. You're the one, holdout on this that's very different than all the rest. Why is that? Why do you have this big difference from all the other people who are into consciousness and spiritual growth and that sort of thing? And I answered his question about time, but then I began thinking about, well, why is that everybody, and it seems almost everyone I run into on the subject of time, they right off the bat tell me about how time doesn't really exist and that future, past, and present. And I always thought that was something they learned from Jane Roberts and Seth Speaks, because Seth says that. He makes that statement, and he makes it very clearly. Well, Seth is a channeled individual, and what Seth says has to be filtered through his medium, who was Jane Roberts. And a medium can only say those things that make sense to her from her own experience, her own knowledge base, her own, or lack of knowledge. So I figured, well, that was just one of those things that Jane didn't get right. And I understand where it comes from, because we have these databases that are the future probable and the past. And the future probable is everything that could happen and the probability it might, and the past database is everything that could have happened and the probability that it would have. And then there's a thread through that history that is what we actually did. Okay, and I'm thinking that, well, what Seth was talking about was these databases, because they all exist at the same time. You can go look at the future probable and go look at the past databases anytime you want. They're all there. They all exist at the same time, and that was the confusion. But then when I was told that it wasn't just people who read, Seth Speaks that were having a problem, but all these gurus and otherwise wise people who had a lot of experience with the larger consciousness system, I began to wonder, well, they all didn't read Seth Speaks. Why did they feel that way? And then I realized the answer to that. The answer is that science, physics in particular, has come to the conclusion that time is an illusion. And they mark that down as one of the facts of our reality. Time is an illusion. And that's why all of the wise spiritual people say that, because in our culture, and I mean our culture, it's a world culture, if you disagree with the basic facts that physicists declare is the nature of our reality, then you lose credibility. If you say, there is no gravity, things don't fall down, well, you look foolish when you say that, because that's a fact of physics that, things do fall down when you let them go, and you make a fool of yourself if you disagree with the facts of physics. Well, this thing about there being no time is presented as a fact of physics. Well, as you look into that, it's not really a fact at all. It's an assumption of physics, but they talk about it like it was a fact. Just like they talk about consciousness being a product of the brain. consciousness has to be derived from the brain, and scientists talk about that like it's a fact of our reality because they can't see it any other way, because when you're a materialist, everything has to start with material cause. Therefore, consciousness has to have a material cause, and they talk about it like it's a fact, even though it's a belief. Well, this thing about time is also a belief, but when scientists say this is a fact of reality, then everybody, whether they are gurus or, just the everyday layman, working in a ditch, they all nod their head and go, it must be like that. Time must be, an illusion. We just think that there's time. So that's why almost everyone believes this, is because the scientists have said it. And, they're the high priests. And if the scientists say it, then it's true. That's what scientists do. They tell us what's true and what's not. Except the scientists also have a lot of beliefs. And materialism is one of those beliefs that gets them into a lot of trouble. Okay, here's why the physicists think that way. If you are a materialist, then your philosophy is called material reductionism. That means that material things are made out of smaller and smaller pieces. So, the big things are made out of little things, and those little things are made out of still littler things, and those still littler things are made out of even littler yet things. And so on it goes. That's material reductionism. And materialism has to work that way because everything needs a cause. And the cause is always the littler things. So if you're at, this level of things, then the cause has to be the littler things underneath that. So always having to have a material cause means that you always have to have a cause that's composed of another level down, because everything's cause is at the next level down in the causal chain. See, there's this causal chain. One thing creates the next, creates the next, creates the next. So it's called material reductionism. And there's a couple of things come out of material reductionism. One of them is the determinism. You see, if you're a materialist, then reality is a big machine. And this was the concept in the 17 and 1800s when Newton talked about gravitation and began to show us the mathematics that governed our solar system and other things. And the Newtonian view was this is we call it a clockwork universe. That meant that it was a machine of some sort. And if you understood how that clock worked, you could always predict what that clock was going to do at any given time. You just had to understand all those gears and levers and wheels, and if you understood all that perfectly, you could always predict what was going to happen. Okay? So what that means is you have to have determinism. If you can always predict what's going to happen, then there is no chance. It's a machine. You give it an input, you will always get the same output for the same input. It's just a machine. Okay? That's the way our computers are, our desktop computers. You give it the exact same input, you'll get the exact same output. It's a machine. It will always duplicate because it's algorithmic. It follows rules. One thing leads to the next, okay? So, a physicist will tell you that if the physicist knew the position, energy, velocity, mass, all of these things about every particle in the universe, or even about all the elementary particles in the universe, it could then predict as far forward in time as you wanted to go what was going to happen next, because it's just a big machine, just like the clockwork. Well, now that was a belief in Newton's time, 1800s. The early 1900s, late 1800s, physicists started to get some other ideas. By about 1814, 1815, they'd started their first quantum mechanics experiments, although they didn't call them quantum mechanics right away. They realized by 1920 that our reality was not materialistic. because the quantum mechanics experiments had outputs, had results that were impossible to explain from a materialistic viewpoint. They were probability-based. It was not, if you know what's going on, you can predict exactly what will happen. If you know what's going on, you can come up with a probability distribution of a whole lot of things that might happen. That's the way reality really works. And then you get a random draw from that probability distribution of the possibilities, you see. So they learned that that wasn't the case. But because they didn't have any good thing to replace materialism with, they didn't understand how things could work other than materialistically, they hung on to that. And the further along they got, the more embedded that belief became. Okay, so when you are a materialist, you're also a determinist. Well, when you're a determinist, then things can't just change. There is really no change. Everything's computed. Everything just is however it's going to be. There's some initial state, and since that time, everything has been determined. Well, that doesn't give you time. Well, it does in a sense that it gives you a causal chain where there's time, but the time is artificial. See, time now to a physicist is sort of like time in a movie. Well, we make time in a movie by showing a whole bunch of still shots in quick succession. So a movie is a whole bunch of stills, frames that they call it, and those frames are shown at around 30 frames a second. And that 30 frames a second makes it seem to us as if that motion is smooth and natural and not in little jumps like it is. It makes it look smooth and organic, like there's real people up there on that screen moving and talking and doing the things that they do. But that time for those people is just an illusion. You see, time is created by the rate in which you show the frames. It's not organic to the people in the movie. It's a creation of the frame rate. So you can run that movie at a high frame rate, say, 60 frames a minute, and now you've got everybody moving in double time. Everybody's running around real fast, and things are happening very quickly. Or you can slow it down, maybe 15 frames, and now everybody's in slow motion, you see. So the time of how that the characters, and we'll call them now characters in the movie experience, isn't real. It's a manufactured time. It's an illusion. It's not really that there's time in that movie. You're just seeing a sequence of determined still things, you see. So now that's analogy to the way physicists see time. They say that time is an illusion. We just are going through these computed moments, or these moments, not really computed, but these moments of deterministic, results. Everything's determined, and time is an illusion. Okay, so we have now two camps, two different philosophical groups that are diametrically opposed to each other and hold opposite viewpoints. On one side, you have materialists. Materialists necessarily must believe in determinism, and they will always see, because of determinism, that things really don't change. You see, for things to change requires time. So this is determined. It's not like we're here and we are, I decide to, rub my head this arm or rub my head. All that's predetermined. It's all predetermined from the beginning. So in that case, time really is meaningless. It's just determined stuff that's going to happen, just like in the movie. Those movie characters, the way they run, the way they jump, when they pull out their gun and shoot, whatever, it's all predetermined. They don't have any free will, and they don't have any time. It's just frame rate. Well, they see our reality in the same way. It's all predetermined, a necessity of materialism, and time is an illusion. Okay, so that's the physics viewpoint, and all those ideas go together. Now, from their viewpoint then, free will cannot exist, because free will is people making choices. Well, if free will doesn't exist, then you can't make a choice. If there's no choice, then of course there can't be time. Choice requires time, before the choice, after the choice. So there's really no choice. There's no time, and there's no consciousness. Consciousness is also an illusion. Yes, that is the fundamental belief of materialists. Consciousness is an illusion. We only seem to be conscious because, see, there is no choice. Everything is deterministic. So, with that philosophy, then consciousness is an illusion, time is an illusion, and free will is an illusion. And materialism is true, determinism is true, and that there is no time, no fundamental time, is also true. Now on the other side, we have the opposite. Consciousness is fundamental. Okay? Free will is a requirement of consciousness. If consciousness makes choice, that's what conscious does. It's aware and it gets to choose from some finite decision space. That's the attributes of consciousness. If it's just aware and has no choices, I don't really label that as consciousness. Now, maybe that's my own definition, but I see consciousness as something that has a finite decision space. It's aware and it makes choices. Okay, so there can't be free will, that means there can't be consciousness. So consciousness requires free will. There can't be consciousness if there's not free will. And you can't have free will choices if there's not time for a before and after the choice. So you see, consciousness, free will, and time are all logically necessary for each other to exist. Materialism, determinism, and no time are logically necessary for those three to exist. So you got three things, three attributes, and they're exactly the opposite. The people who think that consciousness, free will, and time are fundamental, they think that materialism and determinism and the concept of no time is an illusion. They say it's only an illusion that this is a material world. See, that's the nature of a virtual reality. Material world's an illusion. So these people see those other people as all illusionary. Materialism's an illusion in a virtual reality, that there's no time is an illusion, and that there is no free will. Determinism is an illusion. You think that's the way it is because you see that there's this causal chain through the material world. But that material world is only a small piece of reality, you see. And the materialists think that that small piece is all of reality, and that's, of course, their big mistake. So that's an interesting thing. So there's two camps that are logically consistent with each other, and that is materialism, determinism, no time. And the other is consciousness, free will, and time is all fundamental. And those are, right now, science is in the camp of materialism, you see.
Materialism doesn't have any logic to it or purpose to it.
Exactly.
You may have logical steps, but it's not logical
in a big picture. You see, that's the problem. Now, if you look at these two, now let's say these are just two philosophical different approaches to reality, but let's look at them, okay? Let's look at the consciousness side. We experience consciousness. All of us experience consciousness. We all experience making choices. And we know that we are the ones making the choice because we could do this or do that, marry that girl or not. You know, we make choices. And we also know that time passes. We see time going by every day. So time, consciousness, and free will are obvious attributes of our environment. All right, and they go someplace. There's a story there. The free will choices is what enables consciousness to evolve through time. So you can't have evolution without time. Well, you don't need evolution if it's deterministic. Nothing evolves, nothing ever changes. But now we look at the other group. What do they have? They have determinism and materialism that have absolutely no point, no reason, cannot change, do not evolve, nothing happens ever. It's dead. It goes nowhere. It is philosophically possible, but it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't make any sense. It sums to nil. That's the problem. You see, you can have determinism, but then once you have determinism, what are you going to do with it? You can't evolve it, you can't change it, it can't grow, it can't learn. There is no such thing as learning. There's no such thing as growing. It's just whatever is, and that's the end of it, you see. There's no purpose, there's no point. And it's the same thing with, without time, there's no change. Things can't change without time. Oh, it's just an illusion. We see things changing all the time. So there seems to be time, but they'll tell us it's an illusion. Well, you see, we think that the fact that they think there's no time is an illusion for them. But at least this viewpoint that has consciousness, free will, and time goes someplace. It has a story. It's not just a dead end with nothing. Evolution is what makes things go. Evolution is what's created our reality frame, has evolved. Evolution is what we see in our world all over. Economies evolve, technology evolves, government evolves, economic systems evolve, everything evolves. Our attitudes evolve, our consciousness evolves. Evolution requires time. It requires choice making. We're growing, we're becoming something. We have purpose, we have point. It's a system that's alive and doing something and growing. The other system is dead, does nothing, can do nothing, has no purpose, has no products, has nothing, you see. So though they are both logically possible, one is a big zero that has no point or purpose, and the other is something you can live, you can grow, you can
Unlimited
become.
potential.
It's experience. See, there really is no experience, and everything is an illusion. So why would we as a people who every day make choices, free will choices, and who see change, and who are conscious and aware, why would we think that that was an illusion? You see, it's kind of hard to convince us that that's an illusion because we experience it every day. Now, on the other hand, the materialists who only see a little piece of life, which is the part that has very low uncertainty. Okay, so the materialists who only see a piece of existence, which is the piece that has very low uncertainty, that's the part that resembles their material world, where there's very little uncertainty. They also live in the same world we do, make choices, right? See change, and are aware of things, but they claim all that is an illusion. And they have nothing to offer on the other side, what the value is of theirs and where it might go and what its point is. So that's kind of why the world out there in general thinks that time is an illusion, because the scientists think time is an illusion. It's not because everybody read Seth Speaks. It's because everybody listens to what the physicists say about the nature of reality, because they're the high priests. And the lesser priests have to agree with them. Otherwise, they'll be seen as foolish. Consciousness itself invented regular time as a way to sequence things, which gave it more possibilities, more ways that it could create and lower its entropy. And in doing so, it created a state-flipping metronome, a 1-0-1-0-1-0 metronome. And that is the fundamental clock now for everything else. But time actually existed before that. So consciousness evolved regular time, and now it's a fundamental component of consciousness. But before it did that, there was still consciousness. It just wasn't able to sequence things. It could only do patterns and patterns of patterns and patterns of patterns of patterns. That's the only thing it had to create with, to lower its entropy with. Then sequences of things, sequences of patterns, gave it a whole other dimension that it could expand its potential into. You see, so that's the story of time. So time is very fundamental, and it goes back before regular time. And you need time for consciousness. Remember that fundamental unit of primordial consciousness was the this state or that state. It could be in one or the other. Well, then if it's in this one and it was in that one, you see there's a time. There is no change. You can't change from one state to another if there's no time. Time doesn't allow anything to change. Without time, everything just is and nothing ever can change. There is no change without time. So what kind of a wonderful system and what kind of wonderful things can the system do if by definition it does nothing and can do nothing because there is no time? So you see, no time is a dead end. Materialism is a dead end, and determinism is a dead end. They don't create anything. They don't allow growth. They don't allow learning. It doesn't allow change. It doesn't allow anything to take place other than just what is. With materialism, whatever the calculations are going to calculate in the big clockwork is whatever it calculates in the clockwork.
It seems incongruous to some of the philosophers who always thought about time and they thought about purpose. What is our purpose here? One of the big questions. And with the materialist view, it doesn't look like there is any purpose.
No, there can't be any purpose of any sort. You see, our purpose here is to grow up, to evolve. And without time, there is no evolution. There is no growing up. Growing up means change. Evolution means change. Without time, with materialism and determinism. And of course, you can't have materialism without determinism. And when you have determinism, then time just becomes a nuisance. So we get rid of the time, because in determinism, there also is no change. Things just are how they're going to be. And time is irrelevant, you see. So that's this thing about time. Okay, there's these two different philosophies. One of them goes someplace, has meaning, has purpose, has a function, develops, evolves, and is significant. The other is dead, just dead, dead end. Means nothing, has no purpose, can never have a purpose, goes nowhere, accomplishes nothing, has no products. It just is and is dead. Even rocks do more than that. A rock at least can erode. It can slowly disappear. This can't even do that. It just is and can't change. Rocks change as they weather, and as rain and the wind changes a rock, but this thing will never change. So it's dumber than a rock. Has fewer choices than a rock, you see. So now, if you were going to base your reality on one of these two things, you see, and both are logically possible, it's a pretty obvious choice. Why would you want to say this reality is based on materialism, which is dead, as opposed to this reality is based on consciousness, which is alive and living and choice-making and does have purpose? Because we find here that things are alive and living and do have purpose. Why would we think that materialism and no time and determinism are good ideas? It's sort of like the same thing with the scientists, because they're backed into a corner with materialism. Now this is, again, materialism backs them into a corner of determinism and the no time. Materialism backs them into a corner with this many worlds thing. It's a similar kind of thing. Well, every time any electron changes its spin state, a whole new universe has to be created, you see? And that's silly.
Not very efficient.
Not very efficient. It's just a really, really dumb idea. And the reason that it has to be down at that level is because if you said, well, okay, electrons, they're not too important. They do that all the time and it doesn't make a difference. We don't have to do that. And okay, the fact that I scratched my head with this hand instead of that hand, not too important. We really don't have to flip a whole universe just for that. Well, now you have a choice maker. Somebody has to determine where's the threshold and what's important and what's not, you see? Well, we end up with a choice maker someplace. Well, materialism can't have that. There are no choice makers in materialism. So we have to take it all the way down to that electron changing its, because you can't have a choice maker. That's why every single thing that happens has to create a new universe. A rock somewhere in the Rocky Mountains where there isn't anything around for 100 miles in any direction, rolls 2 inches downhill, a whole new universe has to start, you see, because that's the way materialism is. Every change creates another universe, and that is a ridiculous idea.
Isn't that an Occam's razor good example there?
No, that kind of fails Occam's razor. Occam's razor and basic physics will tell you that things that are fundamentally true tend to be simple and elegant. And many worlds is probably the least elegant thing that I could imagine. It's a brute force monster that makes no sense whatsoever. But it's not logically impossible. It's just improbable. You know, it's just ridiculous. So it's a similar kind of thing. And physicists, when they always are backing themselves into a corner with materialism, because materialism just isn't right. It's not the way the world works. So they end up with these ridiculous things that are forced on them by materialism, like the many worlds theory, like determinism, like no time. So they back themselves in these logical corners and then have to say something perfectly ridiculous to escape the corner. Well, at least pretend to escape the corner. Well, you know, fundamental religious people are the same way. If you confront them with dinosaur bones, they make up something perfectly ridiculous to make that not count. And you make up other sorts of things, you know, the age of the universe and other things that are contrary to their beliefs, and they'll just make something up to make that not count. That's the nature of belief, and we can see that scientists are not immune from that. They have beliefs, and when cornered, they make up something perfectly ridiculous to try to, you know, get out of that inconsistency.
Well, let's go back to the yogis and the Eastern philosophy. You mentioned that they have this idea of time from the physicists, but they also are aware of the Akashic Records. And the Akashic Records are something similar to your databases.
Right, and in there, future, past, and present are all available, all at the same time, you see. But that's not our reality. That's a database. Once you understand virtual reality, you'll see that's just a database here. That's not at the core or the nature, the substance of the reality is a database. And I think that does have a possibility of being misunderstood. Okay, the future and the past are all together in a database. Well, you know, you go to any library and the past in the history books is available in the library at any time, right? That's the way a database is. And the future is available only in terms of probability, not in terms of facts, in terms of possibilities and the probability of those possibilities. So that is all available. Now, if these yogis and smart people, if that's their reason for thinking that you know, the past and the present and the future are all available now, well, that's true. They're all available in the database now, but that's just a database. That's not about the core of this reality at all. That's just an artifact of working this particular virtual reality. Virtual realities need databases. You need to keep track of what's happened because you have to keep track of the possibilities. You see, you need to know the possibilities because the way you make things happen is taking random draws from a distribution of the probabilities of all the possibilities. Well, you have to know what those possibilities are and what their probabilities are. That's kind of how the virtual reality is run. That's the motor that makes it run. That's how you pick things that are not known yet. So things that have a lot of uncertainty around them. So you have to have that, and then as time goes on, that probable future just turns into a past database. As time runs on, the future becomes present, becomes past. So now you have this big past database. So it's just one of the parts of the computer code that has to create this virtual reality is that you have these databases. It's local to this virtual reality. It doesn't have anything to do with the fundamental nature of reality. It has to do with the mechanics of computing this virtual reality is what it has to do with. But in that sense, they are all at the same time. But that's not a big picture. That's a little picture.
It's fascinating how you say you can go back into the databases. I mean, you see in literature all the time, people are fascinated with going back to the past and thinking that they can change something in the past. But that doesn't allow for free will. That is something that has that set of choices has been made,
Right.
and you can look at it and maybe learn from it.
That's
But
strictly a
there's nothing
Hollywood
else.
thing.
Yeah.
The Butterfly Effect. It was a movie. You can go back and change something in the past, and then suddenly the present has just instantly changed to reflect that change in the past. Well, it doesn't work like that. That makes a nice story, and I guess it's it's got merit as fiction, but it's not the way the world works. You can go back into the past database. It's just a database. You can make a change there as far as seeing how the probabilities worked. Remember, that's all the things that could have happened and the probability that they might have happened. So you can go back there and manipulate those probabilities. Say, all right, here I was back in the past 30 years ago, and if I had done this differently, how might the probabilities played out? Well, then you can do that. So you can see changes go. Given that probability, change this, then there's different things were probable because of that different choice. Every time you make a choice, it opens some doors and closes other doors, changes the possibilities. So you can do that and follow that. So you can do what-if analysis back there, but it's still just a database. Because you changed something in the past isn't going to make anything change in the present or in the future. It's just a database of what could have happened and the probability that it might have. That's all it is. But you can, yes, go back there and you can not only relive it, but you can modify it. But you're just playing in a database. It's like playing inside of Google. You're playing in a database. It doesn't affect anything outside of the database.
There's so many questions about the past databases, such as what actually happened as opposed to what's in the history books. When you go back to those databases, do you see the event as it actually happened?
Sure. You see it as it actually happened. You
So
get
that
the
could
data.
be in conflict with
It might be in
history.
conflict. It might be in conflict with history, absolutely. And if you want to get an appreciation for that, I recommend everybody find a book called The Lies My Teacher Told Me. It's a book written by a history professor, and he is setting the record straight about the things that are in American history particularly, that are just not true. They're just lies. Things weren't like that. But it was politically expedient that people thought that they were like that. So that was put out. We call that propaganda, and it was believed, and it was passed down, and it was put in the history books. And there's a lot of things that we read in our history books that just aren't true.
Now, how did he determine
What was true?
what was true?
Oh, he went back and read the documents of what happened at that time. In other words, he went back and got, original material from that time to determine really what was going on, not the way we wanted it presented. And evidently there was plenty of documentation at that time. He's talking about American history. This particular professor, I think, was an American history professor. And of course, by then, lots of records were kept, and there was, lots of material that you could work from. And he found he could tell you what actually happened and why it was politically expedient to not believe that or to have another story, and how that story got started and who started it and how it got spread around and now everybody believes it. So he could document all of that. But it's called The Lies My Teacher Taught Me or The Lies My Teacher Told Me. But anyway, go look it up. It's a really good book, and it'll surprise you because many of the things that you were taught in American history just aren't like that, just weren't like that at all.
So memorizing all those things in history isn't a worthwhile cause. It's not a measure of intelligence, is it?
No, well, one of the things that you hear a lot is history is written by the victors. That's a common term or little saying, And it's true. You know, the people who lost don't get to write the histories. The people who win write the histories. So the people who end up in power, usually that means political power and military power, those are the people that get to tell the story that they'd like to tell. And they generally tell a story that suits them, that's good for them, good for their future, good for getting people to rally around them, etc., make them look good. And they don't tell the story that makes them look bad. So that's the way history is written. So all the history we read was written by the people in power who had a vested interest in that history being a certain way, and they write that down, and after that we slavishly copy it, and you know, generation after generation reads the same old junk that isn't true. And it's unfortunate because you learn from your history. And a lot of lessons that we should have learned, we didn't learn because of those lies about our history.
I wonder about the things that are going on today. I wonder how those will be written about in history.
Well, if there was ever a time that returned to propaganda as its fundamental, means of communication, then we're it. So my guess is now it's virtually impossible to find out the truth of anything because you have so many conflicting reports about everything that unless you didn't have to work for a living and spend all your time, digging up facts, maybe you could find some truth. But even then, what's a fact and what's propaganda? Hard to sift through it.
It's all smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, well, see, that has been the strategy of those who would like to control our sense of history. It's their strategy of how to beat the internet. The internet was a big level the playing field sort of thing. Anybody could write down the facts as they saw them. And if you wanted to control the story, you were in trouble now because people who were there could write down the facts as they saw them. Not only one person, but lots of people could do that. And how were you going to shut those people up so that you could write your version of the story, which you prefer over the truth? Well, they were very upset about this internet thing because suddenly it was going to let people on the scene report it to millions of other people. Stories wouldn't be able to be manipulated so easily. The solution? Misinformation. The solution is put so much junk and trash and 100 different versions of a story out there so that nobody knows what to believe, and then your lie is just as believable as the truth or anybody else's lie, you see. So now if you just happen to own more newspapers than anybody else, your lie gets spread further than all the other lies and yours wins. And that lie then becomes truth. So the antidote to the internet was disinformation. So in a system of information, you still can get away with things if you're clever about the disinformation. So that's just something we have to live with. It's just a part of where we are. It's a part of that fear, ego and belief stuff that we're dealing with, and eventually that'll all get cleaned up. But when? Hard to say. If we're lucky, maybe a couple of decades. If we're unlucky, maybe a couple of centuries. And if we're even more unlucky, maybe a couple of millennia. But eventually we'll get there, and it will all be unraveled. But right now, we are who we are at the level that we're at. Our world accurately represents the consciousness quality of the people in it. And that's who we are. That's what we get. We just have to outgrow it.
Well, thanks, Tom. This has been a very interesting discussion on time and the past, and time for our interview to end. Thank you.
You're welcome, Donna. It's been fun, as always.
Thank you.